An anonymous message suddenly arriving at the busy desks of a major entertainment news outlet on April 6, 2026, made a completely staggering claim. It was a cold, unfeeling digital death certificate stamped in the absolute dead of night. They needed the bright lights of the media. The silence was over. The broadcast of a brutal psychological game was just about to begin. The entire country was about to watch a family be pushed to their absolute breaking point on live television. In early February, the agonizing wait was abruptly shattered. A local television station in Arizona, KOLD Television, received a chilling communication. It was the very first ransom note. This was not a chaotic scribbled demand hastily shoved under a door. According to CBS News, this document was chillingly precise. The sender methodically described the exact clothing Nancy Guthrie was wearing on the night she vanished. Even more terrifying, the author detailed highly specific elements regarding the interior layout and the private contents of the Tucson home. These were intimate, granular details that law enforcement had fiercely protected. A piece of implanted medical technology does not lie to the press. It does not exaggerate for television ratings. They were facts that had never been released to the press or leaked to the public. The person who wrote this letter had been inside that house. They had stood in the rooms where Nancy lived. The note contained a massive demand. The sender required a heavy payment in Bitcoin to ensure her safe return. Cryptocurrency is the lifeblood of modern extortion. It is designed to be decentralized, borderless, and incredibly difficult for financial authorities to trace. The use of Bitcoin indicated a level of technological sophistication that elevated the threat level from a random home invasion to a highly organized digital kidnapping scheme. The Guthrie family was suddenly staring at a way to save their mother. They had the financial resources. They had the motivation. They were staring at a piece of paper that promised to end the nightmare if they just transferred the digital funds. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately stepped in with a completely different perspective. It simply records the mechanical rhythm of life, and then it records the sudden, unending silence. The FBI agents analyzing the case issued a stark and utterly ruthless directive to the family. They ordered them absolutely do not pay a single cent. The authorities demanded that the family ignore the Bitcoin address. They demanded that they let the deadline pass. To a terrified family holding on to hope, this order felt entirely counterintuitive. It felt like a death sentence delivered by the very people supposed to help them. Why would the most powerful investigative agency in the country actively block a family from using their wealth to save their elderly mother? The agents knew something the public did not. They recognized a pattern in the extortion attempt that deeply alarmed them. The precision of the note proved the sender was at the house, but it did not prove they still had the victim. If her failing heart stopped beating at 2:28 in the morning, on the agonizing tension between the desperate family wanting to comply and the federal agents demanding total non-compliance created an explosive atmosphere behind closed doors. Every second that ticked by without a Bitcoin transfer felt like a gamble with an 84-year-old woman's life. The media speculated wildly about the contents of the letter while the family sat in agonizing silence, trapped by the federal directive. What would you do if you received this terrifying letter demanding cryptocurrency for the life of your mother? Would you instantly pay the ransom to secure her safety? Or would you blindly listen to the authorities telling you to hold your ground? Leave a comment below, because the Guthrie family's next desperate decision will radically shift the entire landscape of this investigation. The note at the television station was just the opening move in a much larger and far more sinister psychological war. The agents reviewing the communication noticed the distinct lack of immediate contact with the relatives. A professional kidnapper usually wants the money quickly and quietly. They want to communicate directly with the people who control the bank accounts. The first day of her disappearance, then who exactly was writing these elaborate ransom notes, sending a highly detailed extortion demand to a local news station guaranteed maximum public exposure? It guaranteed a circus. This tactical decision suggested the author was either incredibly reckless, or they had a motive that extended far beyond a simple financial transaction. They wanted the world to watch the family suffer. They wanted to inflict maximum emotional damage on a national stage. The silence from the actual kidnappers, combined with the sudden explosion of highly publicized demands, created a vortex of confusion that threatened to completely derail the entire law enforcement operation from the inside out. The true horrors of that night were still waiting to be unearthed from the data. As the media frenzy intensified around the first ransom note, the actual physical investigation was quietly uncovering a completely different narrative. Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County personally confirmed to national television networks that his department was working in lockstep with the FBI. While the public who was demanding cryptocurrency and dominating the national headlines weeks and weeks later. Distracted by the terrifying demands sent to the news station, the digital forensics team was meticulously pulling apart the invisible infrastructure of the Tucson home. They were looking for the digital footprints left behind in the desert sand. According to One News, the breakthrough did not come from a fingerprint or a strand of hair. It came from a severed digital connection. Investigators secured the router data and the home security logs. They discovered that at exactly 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, the doorbell camera mounted at the front of the residence was abruptly and deliberately disabled. Someone had approached the house and systematically blinded the primary security system. The digital timeline was beginning to solidify. Nancy arrived home at 9:48 at night. Almost 4 hours later, at 1:47 in the morning, the electronic eyes of the house went dark. Forensic technicians worked relentlessly to recover the corrupted data from the disabled camera, who was intentionally torturing a high-profile family that likely already knew the devastating truth hidden deep within a proprietary medical data log. When they finally restored the fragmented video files, the screen revealed a terrifying image. The ghostly silent footage showed a man wearing a mask deliberately approaching the property mere seconds before the feed was permanently cut. This was the physical breach. This was the moment the secluded sanctuary was violated. But as the investigators analyzed the timeline of this physical intrusion, they began to notice a glaring, terrifying inconsistency. The actions of the masked man at 1:47 in the morning suggested a rapid, violent, and localized home invasion. He blinded the camera to avoid immediate detection on site. However, the elaborate ransom note sent to the television station days later felt entirely disconnected from this brute force reality. The letter was calculated, highly produced, and aimed directly at manipulating the national media. Law enforcement experts began to deeply question if the man in the mask and the author of the Bitcoin demand were even the same person. Could a street-level intruder orchestrating a physical break and simultaneously execute a sophisticated, the people who exploit family tragedies from the shadows always leave a digital trace in their own blinding arrogance? Digital extortion campaign aimed at a major news network. The two profiles violently clashed. The tension within the command center escalated dramatically when weeks began to pass without a single shred of verifiable evidence that the victim was still breathing. In the high-stakes world of kidnapping, the most crucial element of any negotiation is the proof of life. It is the undeniable confirmation that the hostage is alive and that the extortionist actually has the power to return them safely. According to Hello Magazine, no such proof was ever provided. There was no current photograph of Nancy holding a recent newspaper. There was no garbled audio recording pleading for help. There was only the endless, agonizing silence from the captors and the relentless demands for untraceable digital money. The complete absence of this vital proof deeply disturbed the federal agents. It cemented their ruthless directive to the family to refuse payment. We will break down the exact timeline of that night to understand how a quiet neighborhood became a crime scene. You do not hand over cryptocurrency to a ghost. You do not fund an extortionist who cannot even prove they are holding the asset. The police realized they were investigating two entirely different crime scenes simultaneously. One was the physical house in Arizona where a violent masked man disabled a camera in the dead of night. The other was the sprawling, chaotic digital landscape where anonymous actors were weaponizing the victim's famous last name for financial gain. The investigation was splitting at the seams. The masked man represented the terrifying reality of the abduction, while the ransom notes increasingly looked like the work of parasitic opportunists circling the tragedy. The authorities were staring at a sprawling, complex web of deception. They knew that somewhere hidden beneath the layers of media manipulation and disabled security cameras, the brutal truth of what happened to the 84-year-old woman was waiting to be found. We will trace every single digital ping and every silenced camera to separate the actual intruder from the opportunistic scavengers circling the case. But before they could reconcile the man on the video with the author of the letters, the situation fractured even further. The investigators realized that the silence of the kidnappers was not a negotiation tactic. It was a terrifying indicator of the reality on the ground. The lack of photographs and the refusal to provide a voice recording were not signs of a disciplined criminal enterprise maintaining strict operational security. They were screaming red flags pointing toward a much darker and far more permanent conclusion. The digital data was preparing to tell them exactly why the kidnappers were so quiet. The arrival of spring brought a manufactured sense of routine to the national morning broadcast. On the 6th of April, the familiar anchor returned to her seat beneath the glaring studio lights, attempting to project strength to millions of viewers while her private world remained entirely shattered. Stepping back into the public eye was a monumental display of resilience, but it The author of this alleged ransom note insisted they had seen the kidnapped woman alive and moving in Sonora, Mexico. If you want to join me in exposing the complex lies hidden within these unsolved cases, also acted as a massive beacon for the most depraved elements of the internet. The very same morning she bravely looked into the camera lens, the entertainment gossip outlet known as TMZ received a horrifying new communication. This secondary message was drastically different from the initial demands routed through the local Arizona affiliate. It was explicitly designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma on a woman trying to hold her career and her family together on live television. The author of this new document abandoned any pretense of a standard negotiation. They did not ask for a discreet channel of communication. Instead, they went straight to the most voracious tabloid in the country. The text within this message was a masterclass in sadistic manipulation. The sender ruthlessly claimed that the beloved matriarch had already perished. They coldly stated that the demand for cryptocurrency was no longer a fee to guarantee a safe files you need to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories and turn on notifications immediately. Return. But was now simply the price to purchase the geographic coordinates of her hidden remains. The sheer cruelty of monetizing a daughter's worst possible fear was staggering. But investigators immediately spotted a catastrophic flaw embedded directly within the terrifying narrative. The anonymous author suffered from a severe inability to keep their own malicious fiction consistent. In one paragraph, they demanded money for a burial location, while in another section of the exact same document, they boasted about actively watching the elderly woman walk around a specific city in northern Mexico. A deceased victim cannot be simultaneously hidden in the desert and walking the streets across the southern border. This glaring contradiction instantly stripped away the terrifying facade of a hardened cartel or a sophisticated kidnapping ring. It revealed the pathetic reality of the sender. Law enforcement profilers recognized this specific behavioral signature immediately. Our forensic investigation into this digital deception is just beginning. This was not the work of the individual who physically breached the property line weeks earlier. This was the hallmark of an opportunistic parasite. The true crime ecosystem is heavily infested with these digital scavengers. They are individuals who obsessively monitor police scanners and breaking news alerts, waiting for a high-profile tragedy to strike. The moment a famous name is attached to a missing persons report, these perpetrators immediately begin drafting fraudulent extortion emails. They operate completely in the shadows, relying on the chaotic fog of the initial investigation to terrify desperate relatives into wiring untraceable funds before authorities can intervene. They had zero connection to the physical crime scene in the American Southwest. They simply saw a grieving daughter on a morning news program and recognized a lucrative financial opportunity. They were attempting to extort a devastated family using nothing but a fabricated story and a superficial understanding of international borders. The audacity required to exploit a highly publicized tragedy is difficult to comprehend, but it happens in almost every major investigation involving a public figure. The evidence never lies, even when the people involved. Please gently hit the like button on this video if you believe that individuals who orchestrate these fraudulent extortion schemes should face the exact same severe prison sentences as the actual perpetrators of the violent crimes. The psychological destruction they cause is immeasurable. The authorities were now battling a multi-front war. They had to dedicate precious resources to tracking down the internet protocol addresses of these bottom-feeding scammers, while simultaneously trying to locate an 84-year-old woman. The influx of fake leads and fraudulent demands was creating a massive bottleneck in the intelligence flow. Every single time a new message arrived, the family was subjected to another agonizing cycle of hope and immediate crushing despair. The emotional toll was becoming completely unsustainable. The investigators knew they needed to definitively shut down the media circus and stop the scammers from further torturing the relatives. They needed a piece of absolute, undeniable evidence that would completely sever the extortionists from their leverage. Living a completely secluded and deeply ordinary life, while simultaneously sharing the last name of American television royalty, creates a very specific kind of vulnerability. They found that exact piece of evidence resting quietly in a highly secure corporate server room, completely detached from the chaotic crime scene. The key to destroying the scammers' leverage did not require a search warrant or a dramatic raid. It required a simple forensic data extraction from a medical technology company. The detectives requested the proprietary logs containing the transmission history of the internal device keeping the victim alive. They were about to uncover a mathematical certainty that would instantly silence the chaotic noise of the internet trolls. The truth was far more devastating than any fictional ransom note. The most profoundly devastating moment in any missing persons investigation rarely involves a dramatic confession or a sudden physical discovery. It usually happens in a sterile, windowless conference room when the raw, unfeeling data finally speaks. The federal agents called the grieving relatives into a private briefing to explain exactly why they had been so fiercely opposed to paying any digital ransoms. They laid a highly technical diagnostic report on the table. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She resided entirely alone in a quiet, sun-baked neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. It was the complete transmission history retrieved directly from the manufacturer of the cardiac implant. The internal device was programmed to continuously sync its operational status with a mobile application, generating an uninterrupted timeline of its functionality. The agents pointed to a specific line of code, captured exactly 41 minutes after the masked figure had manually disabled the exterior security system. The digital record showed an abrupt, permanent cessation of all telemetric activity. The rhythmic electronic pulses simply terminated. There was no malfunction and there was no battery failure. The device stopped transmitting because the biological environment it was monitoring had ceased to function. The sheer gravity of this technological revelation crushed the air out of the room. This was the darker, deeply guarded family secret that completely reframed the entire public spectacle. While the entire country watched the agonizing drama unfold on television, and while anonymous predators drafted elaborate threats demanding vast sums of cryptocurrency, the victims' loved ones were secretly carrying a completely paralyzing truth. Her days were predictably structured around her health and her faith. They were forced to sit under the blazing studio lights and read horrific descriptions of their mother being held captive in foreign cities, fully knowing that the diagnostic data had already confirmed her tragic passing on the very first night. The profound psychological torture of this dynamic is almost impossible to articulate. The relatives had to publicly endure the malicious taunts of the tabloid media and the internet scam artists pretending that hope still existed when the absolute certainty of the medical telemetry had already shattered their world. The kidnappers never provided a recent photograph or a voice recording because there was simply no one left to photograph. The extortionists were aggressively demanding a ransom for a ghost. The entire media circus was built upon a foundation of absolute cruelty and complete fiction. The agents explained that the immediate disconnection of the internal rhythm monitor indicated a catastrophic medical event likely triggered by the overwhelming physical trauma or the extreme terror of the initial breach. She required daily cardiac medication to survive, and her chest housed a pacemaker that diligently monitored every single beat of her failing heart. The elderly woman's failing system simply could not survive the sheer shock of the aggressive home invasion. The digital autopsy provided by the implant manufacturer completely solved the most confusing contradictions of the case. It perfectly explained the complete silence from the actual physical perpetrators. Once the violent intruder realized the catastrophic outcome of their midnight ambush, they immediately abandoned the property and vanished into the desert, leaving behind zero demands and zero communication. They knew they had nothing to negotiate with. The letters that surfaced weeks later were entirely fabricated by unrelated observers who possessed no actual knowledge of the biological reality inside the house. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the actual perpetrators essentially let the digital scavengers take the blame in the court of public opinion. If you are watching this right now and feeling completely sickened by how medical technology became the only reliable witness in a sea of human deception, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. According to One News and CBS News, her existence was defined by church services, quiet evenings, and the slow ticking of desert time. We need analytical minds like yours in this community to help dissect these deeply complex technological cases. The truth is often buried beneath layers of digital noise. The revelation of the cardiac data completely severed the connection between the terrifying letters and the actual disappearance. The extortionists were instantly neutralized by a string of numbers on a diagnostic printout. They were reduced from terrifying cartel operators to pathetic internet trolls in a single moment. But while the data provided a definitive answer regarding the ransom demands, it simultaneously opened a massive, terrifying void at the very center of the investigation. The family finally knew the agonizing truth about the timeline, but they were left staring into an abyss regarding the physical reality of the crime. The scammers were unmasked as frauds, but the true horror was just beginning to settle over the Arizona landscape. The technological clarity brought a crushing finality to the false hope that had sustained the relatives for weeks. There would be no miraculous rescue across the border, and there would be no successful financial negotiation with a shadowy syndicate. This profound stillness stood in stark, jarring contrast to the blinding studio lights and the stark reality was that the massive federal response, the sprawling media coverage, and the agonizing public pleas were all entirely futile from the very beginning. The medical log, proved that the most critical window for survival had permanently closed before the sun even rose on the first day. The agonizing resolution of this case required investigators to completely separate the sprawling digital mirage from the brutal physical reality. For weeks, the entire narrative was entirely hijacked by the loudest voices in the room. The fraudulent authors of the menacing letters had successfully manipulated the global press corps and tormented a prominent television anchor strictly for their own sociopathic amusement. They represented a modern breed of psychological terrorists who operate with absolute impunity behind encrypted networks. But once the medical telemetry violently tore down their elaborate theatrical production, the glaring spotlight finally swung back to the incredibly quiet residential street where the nightmare actually originated. The digital ghosts were banished, but the terrifying physical threat remained entirely unaddressed. The revelation of the timeline meant that the investigation had to completely restart from the absolute beginning. They aggressively demanded a transfer of half a Bitcoin in exchange for coordinates to her current location, Pace of New York City, where her daughter Savannah Guthrie sat as the powerful co-host of the Today Show. All the resources previously dedicated to tracking complex cryptocurrency wallets and international internet traffic were immediately redirected back to the dusty pavement outside the isolated home. The detectives were no longer looking for a sophisticated syndicate of international extortionists. They were hunting for a singular, violent phantom. The brutal truth was that an individual had deliberately targeted an exceptionally vulnerable citizen living in deliberate seclusion. This person possessed the tactical awareness to locate the primary surveillance lens and manually sever its connection in the darkness. They breached the threshold of a secure environment and initiated a sequence of events so intensely traumatic that a human heart simply surrendered to the terror within minutes. This was not a keyboard warrior sending cowardly emails from thousands of miles away. This was a flesh and blood predator who physically stood on the concrete driveway and forced their way into a completely defenseless reality. The immense tragedy of the situation is that the subsequent media circus completely insulated the actual killer. Savannah was a fixture in millions of American living rooms every single morning. The noise generated by the fake ransom demands acted as a perfect, impenetrable smokescreen. While the authorities were busy chasing digital shadows, the person responsible for the catastrophic intrusion had weeks to cover their tracks, dispose of crucial forensic evidence, and blend seamlessly back into the surrounding population. The family was finally freed from the suffocating psychological grip of the scammers, but they were immediately plunged into a completely different kind of living hell. They were forced to accept that the true orchestrator of their endless suffering had successfully evaporated into the arid southwestern atmosphere. The artificial tension of the countdown clocks and the financial ultimatums was entirely replaced by the cold, heavy dread of an unsolved physical intrusion. The initial delay in recognizing the actual nature of the attack provided an insurmountable advantage to the assailant. By the time the federal teams pivoted away from the digital wild goose chase, the physical trail in the desert had completely vanished beneath the shifting sands and the relentless sun. The critical 48-hour window that dictates the success rate of almost all homicide investigations was entirely wasted on deciphering fraudulent demands from anonymous grifters Nancy chose the exact opposite. She chose the arid isolation of Arizona. The killer essentially received a massive, unintentional head start, courtesy of the media frenzy. The medical data provided a definitive time of death, but it offered absolutely zero insight into the identity of the person standing inside the house when the rhythm stopped. The digital log recorded the exact moment the heart failed, but it could not record the face of the monster who caused it. The authorities possessed the corrupted video file showing the approach, but the obscured features of the intruder offer more questions than tangible answers. The technological autopsy closed the most highly publicized chapter of the ordeal, while simultaneously leaving the most fundamental agonizing mystery entirely unresolved. The family is forever trapped in a torturous state of suspended animation. They know precisely when the end arrived, but they are completely blind to the identity of the architect. The community is left staring at the terrifying realization that a predator capable of executing a lethal home invasion is still walking freely among them, completely unbothered by the massive federal operation that swirled around their crime. She chose a life far away from the cameras, the reporters, and the relentless public scrutiny that followed her daughter. The true horror is not the letters that were sent. The true horror is the absolute silence of the person who actually walked through that door. What this devastating case teaches us about the true cost of fame in the digital age is that the traditional concept of a crime scene has fundamentally evolved. We no longer solely rely on blood spatter analysis or dusted fingerprints to reconstruct the final moments of a victim. The modern forensic landscape is entirely dominated by the Internet of Things. Smart appliances, connected security networks, and implanted medical hardware are rapidly replacing human eyewitnesses. They act as impartial, unblinking observers that constantly transmit our biological and behavioral data to remote servers. This incident perfectly illustrates how a microscopic line of code can possess more investigative weight than dozens of heavily scrutinized witness statements. But alongside this technological evolution, we are also witnessing the rapid expansion of a parasitic criminal ecosystem. But that deliberate isolation created a thin, fragile shield. The intense visibility of celebrity status does not simply attract isolated stalkers anymore. It activates a sprawling, decentralized network of opportunistic predators who view public grief purely as a financial asset. These individuals are highly adept at weaponizing public information to inflict targeted psychological damage on families already navigating unimaginable loss. They operate on the grotesque assumption that extreme emotional vulnerability creates extreme financial compliance. This investigation serves as a grim warning regarding the intersection of massive public profiles and deeply isolated private lives. The digital autopsy provided the definitive facts, but it also exposed the horrifying reality that fame actively attracts scavengers who will enthusiastically monetize your darkest hour. The ultimate lesson here extends far beyond physical security protocols. It requires a profound psychological reckoning with how society consumes and ultimately fuels the machinery of public tragedy. We must recognize that the digital footprint left behind by modern news coverage essentially provides a detailed operational blueprint for the most ruthless emotional manipulators currently operating on the dark web. The very privacy Nancy craved meant there were no roommates to notice a broken window. A devoted mother who spent her entire life attempting to maintain a quiet, dignified existence ultimately had her final moments completely overshadowed by a deafening media storm she never wanted. She deserved peace, but instead she became the reluctant center of a sprawling, multi-layered digital nightmare. The cruelest irony of this entire ordeal is that the anonymous letters designed to terrify a grieving family inadvertently provided the only protective cover the actual assailant would ever need. The agonizing truth is that the absolute cruelty of these anonymous messages is not an isolated incident. Sometimes the person drafting the terrifying demands is not a foreign cartel operative or an internet grifter looking for a quick payout. Sometimes the author of the nightmare is actually the victim attempting to desperately conceal a much darker internal reality. The forensic data always exposes the lie eventually, but the psychological damage is entirely permanent. The shadow on the porch has yet to be identified. There were no immediate neighbors awake in the early hours to hear a struggle. If you want to see exactly what happens when the digital evidence points inward instead of outward, click the video on your screen to explore our next entirely unresolved case file. I am Seth. I will see you right there. It is crucial to understand this dynamic between mother and daughter because it explains exactly why a home intruder would not simply grab the jewelry and flee into the night. The intruder or the people watching the news later realized that the real value was the sender then pivoted erratically in the very same document claiming she was not in the physical items inside the Tucson house. The true value was the Guthrie name. The target was the immense wealth and the immediate national media frenzy that could be generated by holding the mother of a famous television personality hostage. The quiet life Nancy built was weaponized against her. She was a gentle 84-year-old woman who needed daily medication just to keep her heart functioning properly. She was not a target for a random burglary. She was a high-value asset in a calculated scheme. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, everything in her carefully structured world appeared perfectly normal. At exactly 9:48 at night, relatives safely dropped Nancy off at her residence after a quiet family gathering. The headlights swept across the driveway as she stepped out of the vehicle. She walked inside her home. The heavy motorized garage door slowly lowered and sealed shut behind her, already dead, and that the money was now a fee to reveal where her body was hidden. The family drove away believing she was safe behind locked doors. Her secluded lifestyle was supposed to protect her from the chaos of the outside world. But when that heavy garage door finally clicked shut into the concrete floor that night, the isolation she cherished instantly transformed into a perfect, inescapable trap. The desert silence she loved so much was about to swallow her completely. The neighborhood remained completely still. There were no barking dogs and no passing cars to disrupt the quiet Arizona night. She was entirely alone with her medical devices and the settling noises of an empty house. The peace of that evening was a total illusion. The very environment she meticulously chose for its safety had unknowingly become the exact setting for a nightmare that would soon broadcast across the entire country. The invisible shield protecting her was completely and permanently gone. The true terror was finally stepping inside her completely unguarded home. It was a chaotic and terrifying ultimatum designed specifically to force a grieving family into sending untraceable digital currency before they had time to think. The timeline of a disappearance is rarely a straight line. It is usually a collection of confusing fragments that only make sense when it is far too late. The morning of February 1st, 2026 began with an uncharacteristic silence. Nancy Guthrie was a woman of profound faith and strict routines. When she completely failed to appear for Sunday Mass, her absence sent an immediate wave of panic through her congregation and her family. She did not miss church. She did not ignore her meticulously scheduled life. At exactly 11:56 in the morning, frantic relatives dialed 911 to report her missing. Law enforcement officers arrived at the Tucson residence shortly after the call. They found an empty house. There was no immediate explanation. There was no 84-year-old woman taking her heart medication. The silence inside the home was deafening. But there was a massive, unavoidable problem with this sudden miraculous sighting across the southern border. As the local police began taping off the property, the realization of what this meant started to ripple across the country. This was not just a missing elderly woman in Arizona. This was the mother of a national television icon. The news broke with explosive force. Savannah Guthrie, the woman who usually delivered the morning headlines to America, suddenly became the tragic center of them. According to Hindustan Times and Hello Magazine, Savannah publicly shared her agonizing torment. She appeared on television utterly broken. She openly agonized over the terrifying possibility that her own massive public profile was the exact reason her mother had been targeted. She questioned if her success had painted a target on the back of a quiet 84-year-old woman living alone in the desert. The guilt was visible and suffocating. The family was desperate for any shred of information. They pleaded for the public to come forward. They begged for the safe return of a woman who desperately needed her daily cardiac medication just to survive. At exactly 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, almost 2 entire months before this media-hungry letter was even, every passing hour decreased the statistical probability of a safe recovery. The desert heat during the day and the dropping temperatures at night were a lethal combination for someone in her fragile medical condition. Law enforcement scoured the neighborhood looking for any witnesses who might have seen a vehicle or a struggle after 9:48 the previous night. But the physical crime scene in Tucson was agonizingly cold. There were no obvious signs of a chaotic struggle in the living room. There was no trail of evidence leading out into the desert scrub. The Tucson house was simply a void where a person used to be. The investigators were running blind, trying to piece together a puzzle with all the crucial pieces deliberately removed. The media circus descended on the quiet Arizona street, broadcasting live updates to a captivated and horrified nation. Viewers watched as the Guthrie family endured the most agonizing waiting game imaginable. Drafted the cardiac pacemaker regulating the kidnapped woman's heartbeat permanently disconnected from its mobile application. But the very first tangible clue regarding the sudden evaporation of Nancy Guthrie did not materialize in the dusty front yard of her home. It did not come from a neighbor who saw something suspicious in the dead of night. It did not come from a forensic sweep of the pristine living room. The first actual break in the case appeared in a place no one was looking. The terrifying answer to the silence in Tucson manifested hundreds of miles away, sitting quietly on the brightly lit desk of a television news editor. A message had breached the perimeter of the investigation. It bypassed the local police department entirely. It bypassed the family desperately waiting by their phones. Someone had carefully drafted a document that was about to turn a localized missing persons case into a federal extortion nightmare. The orchestrator of this event knew exactly how to maximize the terror. They knew that to truly torture the Guthrie family, they needed an audience.